Hi, I'm Jen Southern from the Centre for Mobilities Research at Lancaster University, and thank you for inviting me to speak at Mobilities, Stories, Movement and Art. It's great to be part of this conference, and I'm going to be recording this video for you now, and hopefully I'll be live to answer any questions and have a discussion a bit later on. So this talk begins in 3 places and ends in many more. As anthropologist Anna Singh suggests, we must begin again and again in the middle of things. The stories are multiple. The first starting place is a fascination I have for GPS devices. Now they are mundane, ubiquitous and perhaps insidious companions in our phones and sat-navs. They constantly locate us and guide us to our destinations. But not so long ago, in 2001, when they first became available outside the military, I was enchanted by their ability to connect this patch of earth beneath my feet with its kind of gritty, damp texture, with the light glinting off it, to a grid of abstract coordinates generated by a very particular mapping system of latitude and longitude with its own specific histories and calculated by atomic clocks and satellites. With collaborator artist Jen Hamilton, we decided that we wanted to make this set of coordinates speak of the indeterminate, the poetic, embodied world of movement that we inhabit. GPS operates technically on scales that range from the planetary, that is satellites that are 20,200 kilometres above the Earth, to the subatomic, and when electrons in atoms change energy levels, they emit microwave signals that are used to produce extremely accurate atomic clocks that are used by GPS devices. The scale of navigation that GPS is used for ranges from globe-spanning international flights to detailed and local mapping of individual animals in the wild. In locative art projects, GPS has been used to map traces of movement from long Antarctic voyages, such as in the work of Leila Curtis, right down to very familiar local journeys, for instance in the work of Christian Nold. As a GPS track can record our meandering paths, at the same time it would articulate the sense of being connected to the tiny scale of the atomic clock and the vastness of a system of satellites. And this is one of the things that's continued to fascinate me about GPS, that it can connect different scales and it can connect them in our imagination as well as in the device itself. And this is an image of a whole host of kids flying kites while I was doing a residency in Slovenia a couple of years ago. And you can see the kind of frenetic movement as they run around. The second starting point is Doreen Massey's description in 1991, which will probably be really familiar to a lot of you. And it was written in 91, but I only encountered it after I'd been thinking about GPS devices. And I'm going to read it. It's rather a long quote, but there's a specific purpose that I want to do this. So she says, imagine for a moment that you are on a satellite further out and beyond all actual satellites. You can see planet Earth from a distance, and rarely for someone with only peaceful intentions, you're equipped with the kind of technology which allows you to see the colour of people's eyes and the numbers on their number plates. You can see all the movement and tune in to all the communication that's going on. Furthest out are the satellites, then aeroplanes, the long haul between London and Tokyo and the hop from San Salvador to Guatemala City. Some of this is people moving, some of it is physical trade, some is media broadcasting. There are faxes, email, film distribution networks, financial flows and transactions. Looking closer, and there are ships and trains, steam trains slogging laboriously up hills somewhere in Asia. Looking closer still, and there are lorries and cars and buses, and on down further, somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa, there's a woman on foot who still spends hours a day collecting water. And so Doreen Massey was obviously talking about geopolitics and a sense of place. And there are 2 things that I want to draw attention to in this text. Firstly, the connection between a multiplicity of scales, and secondly, the use of the vivid image and the way that she asks us to imagine the power dynamics, the scales and interconnections involved in a global sense of place. So there's a connection between imagination and scale. And thirdly, I want to talk about Anna Singh. In her book Friction, an Ethnography of Global Connection in 2005, she asks us to let go of the universal of a self-fulfilling abstract truth, and that we must become embroiled in specific situations, and thus it is necessary to begin again and again in the middle of things. And so she's talking about ways that we can think of big ideas about globalization by starting in the middle of what's happening in the world. And in her book, in her 2015 book, The Mushroom at the End of the World, she talks about multiplicity in terms of polyphony. And so she says, when I first learned polyphony, it was a revelation in listening. I was forced to pick out separate, simultaneous melodies and to listen for the moments of harmony and dissonance they created together. This kind of noticing is just what is needed to appreciate the multiple temporal rhythms and trajectories of the assemblage. And we could also think of Lefebvre's use of polyrhythmia to talk about the different rhythms of the city and the different patterns of the city when he talks about rhythm analysis. And so we could think of that in the same way. And finally, Singh also suggests that this storytelling is a form of method. So she says to listen and to tell a rush of stories is a method. And why not make the strong claim and call it a science, an addition to knowledge? Its research object is contaminated diversity. Its unit of analysis is the indeterminate encounter. To learn anything, we must revitalise arts of noticing and include ethnography and natural history. But we have a problem with scale. A rush of stories cannot be neatly summed up. Its scales do not nest neatly. They draw attention to interrupting geographies and tempos. These interruptions elicit more stories. This is the rush of stories' power as a science. And in the rest of this talk, the beginning's been quite heavy on quotes, but the rest of the talk I want to really think about how art practices enable us to engage with this kind of rush of stories on different scales, the way they allow us to connect in a really human way to these kind of vast stories that are so difficult to connect our lives to. Some of those things that it's really difficult to conceive of, problems that are happening on a global scale, and how we might have a way of dealing with that in our lives. And these, though mobilities on multiple scales are hard to grasp, both Massey and Singh are really skillful handlers of that messy sense of scale. So let us start again in another place, in the various formative encounters between art and mobilities. Art and artists have been involved from even the really early days of mobilities research, thanks in part to the generous openness of scholars like John Urry, who welcomed and took seriously artists who approached him. So now I'm going to do a really partial mapping of mobilities and art, and my apologies now for this being very kind of quite European and North American centred. I would really welcome any contributions to this as an ongoing project of mapping. So there have been a series of conferences that have involved art exhibitions. One of the first that I encountered was in 2011, the Mobilities in Motion conference in Drexel University in Philadelphia. And you can see in this list that they come all the way up to the present conference that we're now part of. And many of these, in fact all of these conferences have involved art and artists in mobility scholarship. There's a whole series of journals and special issues that have involved art and mobilities. So this special issue of Leonardo Journal in 2012, edited by Hannah Iverson, Mimi Scheller and Jeremy Haidt. There's the Y Journal of Mobile Media, based at Concordia University, Transfers Journal, that often has a lot of art and mobilities reviews and essays, Vectors Journal, and the Journal for Artistic Research. And this particular example is an article by Michael Zinganel and Michael Hieselmeier, who are both artists involved in mobilities. And then, of course, there are research centres. The ones that I'm most familiar with are the Centre for Mobilities Research here at Lancaster, Pervasive Media Studio in Bristol in the UK, which, although it doesn't call itself a mobilities research centre, it often is working with artists and technologists that deal with ubiquitous technologies and pervasive technologies. The Mobile Media Lab at Montreal, who ran the Differential Mobilities Conference in 2013, also are very active and have also set up and run the Y Journal. Then, of course, outside academia, there's the Mobile Lives Forum based in Paris, and there have been multiple publications that deal with issues to do with art and mobilities. These are just a few of them. And there are artists that have been connected for a long time. So Ellie Clark, who ran the Mobility Project back in 2012 and was also involved in some of the early days of Art and Mobilities at Lancaster. And Platform, as an arts organisation, were in contact in the early days with John Urry at the beginning of the Centre for Mobilities Research. Exhibitions that surveyed forms of art and tracking and tracing mobility, particularly here run by Trampoline, an organisation that was based in Nottingham and Berlin, again in 2011. And the Walk On exhibition, that was a big survey of artists working with walking in 2013 that toured around the UK and was curated by Cynthia Morrison-Bell, Alistair Robinson and Mike Collier. So I've been thinking about how art and mobilities are linked and the ways that art makes a contribution to mobilities. And in a way, there are three kind of main ways that I think they do. And one of those is in developing research methods and bringing art methods into alliance with more social science methods. There are ways in which art practices are able to think about the aesthetics of mobility and broaden and create a deeper and richer set of vocabularies to describe mobilities. And then there are ways that we can revisit art history and think about how mobility is a theme that comes through in a lot of different discourses on art. And I think it does those things partly because artists are often engaging with the materiality of the world, which allows us to think differently, engage in problem solving and research methods that engage with the material of actions through trying to understand how they work in order to manipulate them. Artists often think about multiplicity in different ways. And through that are able to think about scale, and I'll go into more detail about those different aspects of art practice as I go through the rest of the presentation. So art is a mobile research method, and we're all probably really familiar. In 2004, John Law and John Urry asked us to imagine a fluid and decentered social science with fluid and decentered modes for knowing the world, allegorically, indirectly, perhaps pictorially, sensuously, poetically, a social science of partial connections. And it's almost as if they're calling artists to get involved. And we know of various different books about mobile methods, inventive methods, live methods, and mess in social science research. In terms of mobile methods, Buscher, Urry and Witschke in 2010 said social scientists too are on the move, seeking new analytical purchase on these important aspects of the social world by trying to move with and be moved by the fleeting, distributed, multiple, non-causal, sensory, emotional and kinesthetic. And we have inventive methods that are both creative and enact new social realities, so methods that have an impact in the world. We can also think about collective experimentation. Felt and Wynne have written about it in terms of public engagement with science, but it's also useful, I think, in thinking about participatory art as a kind of collective experimentation with the world, through which people try things out and learn from them within participation in an art practice. So secondly, thinking about aesthetics and qualities of mobility. The artist Richard Serra in the 60s wrote a verb list of actions that might contribute to the making of art. And I think it's useful to rethink the way in which artists might engage with mobility and do engage with mobility, and the ways that can increase our vocabulary for the critique of mobility and movement. And so the next section is my version of Richard Serra's verb list, but adapted for mobility. To flow, to slide, to float, to drift, to gallop, to judder, to slow, to rest, to wriggle, to roll, to pitch, to loop the loop, to glide, to stride, to stall, to march, to meander, to surge, to pace, to tumble, to spirit, to sprint, to ride, to freewheel, to pan, to zoom, to search, to explode, to sink, to crawl, to creep, to accelerate, to sneak, to waltz, to flutter, to charge, to gust, to drone, to yaw, to migrate, to be still, to tilt, to track, to race, to shimmy, to jog, to nudge, to dodge, to race, to dawdle, to squall, to fall, to drop, to rise, to tap, to gyrate, to spin, to rotate, to pulse, to motor, to speed, to mosey, to lurch, to shake, to stop. And in thinking about aesthetics and how we think about aesthetics in a really broad way, I also want to bring in Lev Manovich's writing in the language of new media, where he asks us about what art is and how we can think about aesthetics in a different way that's not just defined to the object. So he says, does art necessarily involve a finite object? Can telecommunication between users by itself be the subject of an aesthetic? Similarly, can the user's search for information be understood aesthetically? In short, if a user accessing information and a user telecommunicating with others are as common in computer culture as a user interacting with a representation, can we expand our aesthetic theories to include these two new situations? So I'm really interested in forms of art that aren't necessarily object or image based, aren't necessarily representational, but are dealing with the relationships between things, are maybe dealing with actions, are working with materialities of objects rather than objects themselves, or with manipulating materialities, that are working with participation. So we might think about not just about art and technology, but about relational aesthetics, about participatory art, socially engaged practices, and how those are really part of a mobile art history. So to bring in a few of those people and how they've dealt with scale, we might think about Francis Elise, who's often worked with walking. And this work, The Green Line, from 2004, where he developed a method of walking and art making that left very kind of ephemeral traces. And he was interested in the border between Israel and Palestine, and the green line drawn across the map that drew a line between Jordan and Israel. And the green line, of course, in pencil, took up space on the map, but the space under that green line wasn't as considered. And as a performative piece of work, he punctured a hole in a can of green paint and walked through the city along that borderline, making this much more gestural line that wasn't the strict line of the map. But of course, in doing that, he came across all sorts of borders, and in filming that action, challenged some of those borders in a sense, and kind of brought up the memory of this line being drawn that separated two locations. Neville Gaby, in 2009, made a work titled A Weight of Stone Carried from China for You. And in this work, he was doing a residency at a shopping centre that was being built in Bristol in the south of England. And he became interested in where the stone was coming from to build the paving for the shopping centre. And he discovered it was coming from China, and he wanted to go to the quarry it was coming from. And he saw a stone being quarried out and brought a curbstone back overland through different transportation networks to bring it to Bristol, to kind of make real this sense of the weight of the stone being transported at such a long distance in order to become what is essentially underfoot in the shopping centre. And this curbstone was then engraved and kind of set into the curb in the shopping centre, and is presumably still there now. And so he's drawing attention to those kind of the great distances that seemingly mundane things are shipped, and the specifics of how that might be done and what it means to transport materials that distance. Hassan Alaya has been tracking his own location since 2005. He was brought in for questioning in relation to 9/11 in a case of mistaken identity. And after a long process, he was found to not have been involved in the acts that he was being implicated in. But he was so troubled by the way that the FBI investigated his location and his whereabouts and the problems with verifying where he'd actually been, that as a form of critique, he started to track his everyday movement and his critique of both surveillance and the FBI's methods. And so he's continued to almost create this trail of evidence of where he is and where he's been as a critical project since 2005. And drawing attention to those kinds of networks and surveillance and issues of surveillance and identity and nationality. Louise Ann Wilson, an artist based in the northwest of England, made a work called Warn Scale, starting in 2015 and ongoing, in which she walked with people who were childless by circumstance and walked through the hills and mountains of the Lake District in order to have discussions about childlessness. And so in a kind of flipping this sense of scale from bringing the global into something which is understandable on a local scale, she was taking something very personal and into a greater landscape to enable people to discuss their own experience within a bigger context. And through this walking practice, she's made very, very poetic works that allow people to engage with ideas of childlessness. And finally, Nikki Pugh, who made this work Orrery for Landscape, Sinew and Serendipity in 2016, in which she takes GPS tracking data mainly from cyclists, where people would dot watch their journeys, following exactly where the person is on a map, but turn that into the activities of this tiny machine, where you could see very different kinds of activity being visualized within this sculpture, that you would get much more of a sense of the kind of physical embodied nature of the journey rather than just the dot travelling through a map, and this much more tangible idea of the effort that's going into the physical experience of cycling up a hill, for instance, and the direction that somebody might be going and the weather. And so she's taking data which we would see as ephemeral and making it into something much more physical and embodied. So each of these artists in different ways works with movement and with scale. There's a final example as well. The artist Rebecca Birch, who has just recently performed, just this week, it's a work called The Yellowing, Part 2, Bellmouth, in which she's been visiting a group of women who are protesting the introduction of fracking into Blackpool, which is really quite near where we are now, in the northwest of England. And she's been repeatedly visiting women who go back to this site, and through sitting and standing in front of the gates, through their immobility in front of the gates, are protesting and demonstrating against fracking happening in that location. And so this fracking, which is releasing, or is intended to release shale oil from beneath the ground, under Blackpool, under this region of the country, women bringing their bodies to stand in front of the gates. And every Wednesday they have 15 minutes of silence, just standing quietly in front of the gates, demonstrating. And Rebecca Birch has been filming them and talking to them and recording that process, which she then retells in performances that include video and drawing, and end with this incredible sense of women dancing around in the space as part of that demonstration. And it really connects the way in which these women in their very personal individual lives are coping with and dealing with the sense of being undermined both literally and metaphorically by fracking in that area, and by the more global issues of where sources of power and energy come from, through very specific local acts. And so this is, in a sense, politics on a small local scale relating to a much more global politics of not only of generation of power, but also of environmental and climate change. So those are a series of examples of other artists' work that I think engage with scale and mobility and allow us a different kind of access to the issues that are really pertinent on a small and a large scale. And finally, I want to talk about a project I've been working on recently, collaborating with artist and scientist Dr. Rod Dillon, who works in the Biomedical and Life Sciences Department at Lancaster University. We were commissioned by the Wellcome Centre for Anti-Infectives Research at Dundee and Neon Digital Art Festival to produce an artwork that would engage with Rod's research into a parasite called leishmania and the work that the Wellcome Centre do in drug discovery, in combating and killing that particular parasite. And what we decided to do was to retell the story of this parasite on a variety of scales in a number of different ways. And we've worked together previously on some art and science projects. And what this project does is to bring some of my past work in which I've been looking at the mobilities of animals and trying to track mobilities of animals in kind of more than human storytelling, with Rod's research and artworks to do with leishmania. Now, we know that leishmania is a parasite that is transmitted by sandflies between humans and other mammals. So the sandfly can live in the sandfly, and it can live in a human, and has different parts of its life cycle take place in each of those situations. It can also live in dogs, which are a kind of reservoir for the parasite, and it can then be communicated by the sandfly back from the dog to the human. And leishmania has been around for millions of years, we think. This is an image of a Peruvian whistling vessel, which is said to be representing somebody with cutaneous leishmaniasis, so with sores on their face that are caused by the leishmania parasite. This is an ancient vessel from Peru. There is genetic research into a particular strain of leishmania that is found in Brazil, and the genetic research suggests that it's only been in that particular strain started from a very small population of the parasite and has only been in Brazil for the last 500 years, and that suggests that it was brought to Brazil in Portuguese war dogs with the conquistadors, and so it's another disease that was brought to Brazil and to South America by European invaders. And leishmania, so it has quite a long history and is caught up with histories of colonialism and of invasion, as well as its own micromobilities around the body. As a disease, leishmaniasis is particularly takes advantage of situations where there's war, where there's poverty, where people can't protect themselves from sandflies with bed nets, with other forms of avoidance of sandflies because of unstable living conditions. and often where people are living in close proximity with dogs. And so what we decided to do was to try to tell the story of the parasite across history and on microscopic and global scales. And to do that, we decided to build a website that tried to tell the story from the parasite's perspective. We wanted to do this while never losing sight of the seriousness of the disease, the deadliness of the disease, but doing the storytelling from this kind of parasite's eye view. And so we made a travel blogging website for Leishmania, and we installed a selfie booth in the festival, so that people would take selfies with the parasite, and through that could spread the idea of this website. And so we have 8 different travel blogs. I'm going to quickly go over them now and talk a little bit about what happens in each one of them. So Leishmania.we is the story of Leishmania in the wild. It's the story of the life cycle of this minute parasite and its life cycle through the body of humans, dogs and sandflies. And this is told in the voice of Instagram in a way. It was written originally by Rod and then revoiced by one of his MA students, Yasmin, who is a big social media user and could put that narrative into. She's also she's also doing her own research on Leishmania, and so she was able to put that narrative into a really social media language and give voice to the parasite. Sandflyer is another Instagram account, and that's the story of Leishmania living in Rod's lab, where he does experimentation with sandflies and how the Leishmania travels through the gut of the sandfly. So it's a very kind of situated view of the parasite actually within the sandfly, and how the sandfly transmits the parasite to the human. And this view goes through Rod's lab and into situations with sandflies. Freezer Cat 3 is looking at the labs in Dundee where they're doing the drug discovery research, and for this one we put cameras through a lot of the machines they use in order to do huge batches of experiments, testing different chemicals and working out what chemicals are going to be effective on killing Leishmania, but also are going to work within the human body. Ghost Horde is a bit of an interloper. Ghost Horde is actually not a story of a parasite, it's the story of the drug that has been discovered in the labs in Dundee, and the way that it kind of goes into the body, and it's told almost as a detective or thriller, in which the drugs are seeking out the Leishmania in order to kill it and assassinate it. Electra Dominica is a much older story. Sandflies have been found encased in amber, and sandflies are known to have existed around the time of the dinosaurs as well. Genetically, they've been tested and found to be genetically a genetic history going back to the time of the dinosaurs, and there are reptilian versions of Leishmania, and so this Instagram feed tells the story of a sandfly, a Leishmania trapped in a sandfly, almost static and caught in amber. It's quite a slow story, but it's quite beautiful imagery of a sandfly in amber. And I should have mentioned that each of these 8 stories are released first through social media and then go automatically onto a blog, so that the story unfolds through social media, and you can get that story alongside your social media feeds during the duration of the project, and then it's all housed on the blog afterwards. Unleashed is part of that historical story, which tells part of the story of the story that I told previously about the kind of colonial traveller of Leishmania around the world. So the way that it went to Brazil, the way it travelled along a lot of the the routes and roads that were built in India by English colonisers that actually also enabled leishmania to spread much more quickly throughout India. And so it tells these global histories of leishmania as almost a kind of a product or that's helped along by colonialism. And it's told in the style of a newspaper column that was written by two Scottish ladies who were asked to travel the world for a Scottish newspaper based in Dundee, and so it's told in that kind of style. LD Bob is research done through the academic study of leishmania. LD Bob is the strain that is used in labs, and this Twitter stream follows the story, the ancestry, kind of finding the ancestry of this particular strain, LD Bob, and why it got to be called LD Bob in the first place. So it's a kind of scientific tracking of a particular strain of leishmania. Visceral media tracks the way that leishmania and leishmaniasis is written about in the media. So it's reposting on Facebook of lots and lots of information and news stories about leishmania. So those are the 8 different stories, and we were really helped in this telling these stories. Partly they're the stories of Rod's scientific research, and partly they're an artistic collaboration between myself and Rod to make visible these different layers and interweaving of multiple stories that are the history of leishmania. So leishmania isn't just the thing that's studied in the lab, it's embedded in really problematic histories of global travel, of colonialism, but there was also much more ancient histories of its development from being a reptilian parasite through to being human parasite. And then there's the mobilities on the microscopic scale, and how this quite amazing organism manages to transform itself as it travels through the cold-bodied sandfly and the warm-blooded human or dog and mammal. And it changes form as it travels through those different bodies, and with different parts of its lifespan, its life of its form. So sometimes it has in its promastigate form, it has flagella that enables it to move independently and to swim. And in its amastigate form, it's a cell that moves within the bloodstream. And so we told these stories as travel stories that of flow through the body and in and out of different bodies. So to briefly conclude this talk on the mobilities of scale and its relation to art practice, I suggest that art is an accessible method of multiscalar, multi-species storytelling. That artists have already been making visible the problematic and interwoven stories and histories of what Anna Tsing would call contaminated diversity. And art practice can connect the vastness of global events and networks and the imperceptible microscopic scales of microbes with the human scale of living and being in the world. And that this is necessary in order for us to imagine ways that we might act in the world differently. Thank you for listening. I hope that it's not been too difficult to do that with this rather strange medium of speaking to video with no audience in the room. And I'm looking forward to having a conversation with you via Skype when at the end of this video. Thank you.